Hola, mi nombre es Emmy Celeste Alvarez Martinez. Silence. This is the exact same sensation I felt the moment I crossed the big brown door of my early childhood center. All I can remember is my mom bawling her eyes out crying as she attempted to conceal her emotion, as if repressing it would somehow eliminate the permanent path her tears had already marked. But the innocence in me at 5 years old didn't allow me to understand the extent of her anguish, of her worry, or even of her concern. But as soon as the solemn words that managed to escape the grip of my mouth ricocheted off of the expressionless faces around me, I knew. I knew that from the way I talked to what I talked about, I was different. But rather than growing prideful, I grew guilty. Because as preschool for others was a time of educational exploration and self-discovery, for me, it was simply filled with wounded silence. Because day after day, I went home and sat on an almond brown couch armrest surrounded by ubiquitous symbols of the English and Spanish language, from the hungry, hungry caterpillar to la oruga muy hambrienta. And I never understood why. Why, if I knew how to read, how to write, how to speak, then why is it that my nights were filled with the earnest sound of my broken sentences? Or why is it that all I could see was the shattered lead on the paper that cradled my broken words? Or why is it that all I could feel is the empty laughter still pulsating through my spine? Why is it that at 5 years old, I associated my worth with that of my developing language? Why is it that at 5 years old, I didn't understand why I was being silenced? Why is it that at 5 years old, I was barred by the disparaging language collision that occurred between my mother tongue and my developing language? Barred by the either or that demanded I abandon my mother tongue or my developing language, and barred by an educational system that at times made me believe that my mother tongue had no place, as if it didn't belong. But how can something that lies at the core of who you are, of who you aspire to be, and who you will become not belong if it carries an intimate piece of your identity that, if lost, will never be regained? And though the wounded silence was merely temporary for me, for 5.12 million English learners in the United States public education system, it is not. And though the US Department of Justice states that all English learners are entitled to appropriate language assistance services that aid them in becoming proficient in the English language in order to subsequently engage academically within a reasonable period of time, the reality for us is very different. Because as you imagine the 5-year-old version of yourself staring at an empty reflection, or the 15-year-old version of yourself sitting in the corner desk of the distant classroom, both equally surrounded by an iridescent silence that somehow manages to penetrate your existence, the aid remains the same. Because whether you are a compound bilingual with parallel cognitive development, or a coordinate bilingual with siloed language enforcement, the aid remains the same. Language acquisition is not something that can be controlled, it is not something that can be perpetuated, and it is definitely not something that can be predicted. Because as a study conducted by Stanford University on 2 California school districts recognized for their high English language acquisition success rates found, in order to proficiently speak the English language, a minimum of 3 to 5 years is needed. But in order to academically engage, an average of 4 to 7 years is required. But what happens when English language development classes focus on and foster unsustainable growth and development? According to the Hetchinger report, only 67% of English learners earn a high school diploma. And in the analysis of the National Education Longitudinal Study of 1988, 47% of those that graduated within 2 years had not enrolled at a college or university. And 18% of those that enrolled at a 4-year institution, over the span of 8 years, only 1 in 8 obtained a bachelor's degree. And I know that college is not the only path, but it is a path that amongst many others remains highly inaccessible to English learners. And with 60% of English learners already forming a part of low-income communities, the language barriers to continue to go unfazed by our educational system will simply continue to perpetuate the limited economic prosperity and upward social mobility that reigns in the absence of bilingual education. Language acquisition is not something that can be controlled. Because bilingual education, beyond transmitting knowledge through a student's mother tongue, it is a medium of language accessibility that unearths the silenced testimonies that for too long have fallen prisoner to the wounded silence that plagues all bilingual students. And I understand that limited resources is an external factor that hinders the presence of bilingual education, and even portrays it as a matter of precarious balance. But isn't 20% of the United States public education system represented by bilingual students a precarious balance worth fighting for? Because today the conversation began, but tomorrow the action must continue. Because bilingual education is a medium of language accessibility that heals the broken words that somehow managed to escape the wounded silence. So if you are a student, implement a tutoring system at your school that connects students through their mother tongue. Or if you're a professional, talk to HR, demand language accessibility, not only for employees, but also for customers. If you're a parent, protect your child's mother tongue. Protect that intimate connection it shares with their identity, that if lost, will never be regained. If you're an English learner, seek strength in your language. Seek strength in the power your mother tongue holds. If you're a bilingual student, do not sacrifice your mother tongue or your developing language for the either-or that will always demand it. And if you're a bilingual student, empower others. And if you're a monolingual speaker, realize the power that your language holds, because you too have the capacity to build the necessary bridges that heal the broken words that fill the wounded silence. And in honor of all the mother tongues that have been lost, all of the silenced voices that accompany us, and all of the past, present, and future silhouettes of English learners and bilingual students, bilingual education is and must be recognized as a basic human right. Thank you.